What's going on, everyone? My name is Mr. H22, or aka the world's most precious little Christian boy, and welcome back to my channel. Today we are doing another one of my discussion videos, and in today's video we are talking about the problem with modern horror games. Now, horror games have come a really long way in the modern era. Some could say that they've changed for the best and they're better than ever, and some could say that they've changed for the worst. I'm someone who kind of sits on both ends for the most part. Because you've got some great unique horror games that are not only fun and um do something different while also succeeding while doing something different, because doing something different in a genre comes at a price, because you can either ruin it and maybe people won't like it, or maybe you can make it too different. But you've got some great horror games that add new things and mix up the formula a little bit. And then you have horror games that feel like literally every other horror game you've played before. Just boring and, more of the same of what you've been experiencing ever since you even started playing horror games. And I gotta say, the fact that it's rare nowadays that when a horror game comes out and it actually has different elements, more variety, and actually does something a little different, it's honestly sad that that's a rare phenomenon these days from, developers. Now, let me start by saying I have absolutely nothing against Amnesia: The Dark Descent. It's a modern, I mean not a modern, but like well, kind of modern, but it's one of the very first horror classics of the 2000s, if you could say. And again, I have nothing against that game. It's not my style, but it's a good game for the people who enjoy it. But I feel like Amnesia accidentally started a really bad trend, and that trend is basically the whole you're completely defenseless and you can't fight back from literally anything. All you can do is just run, hide, or die. Now, this mechanic, I'm gonna be calling it a mechanic throughout this video, because that's basically what it is. Because a mechanic is a game that's something that I'm trying my best to explain it, but I'm not going to. That's not what the video is about. I'm not gonna waste my time. I'm on a time schedule here because I got more videos to make. But basically, it's a mechanic. Okay, it's the whole you can't fight back thing mechanic. That's what I'm going to be calling it throughout this video, because that's essentially what it is. And again, I have nothing against Amnesia, but man, it started a horrible trend. Amnesia might have actually started one of the worst trends for the horror genre. Now, many believe that Amnesia kind of saved the horror genre, because back in the days when Amnesia actually came out, horror games were kind of having like this identity crisis where instead of it being scary anymore, the games would it would just give the player these big badass weapons and just let them kill everything. And people say Resident Evil 4 is like the best Resident Evil, but Resident Evil 4 is actually the worst Resident Evil, because that's actually the game that kind of started the downfall of Resident Evil, because like that game literally gave you every weapon to use and every weapon to fight back with, and it just wasn't scary anymore. I mean, Resident Evil 4 didn't even have the zombies anymore. Like, I know people talk about the regenerators, but those aren't zombies. Resident Evil was supposed to be about zombies. So anyone who thinks Resident Evil 4 is the best Resident Evil, it's okay if you like that game, but Resident Evil 4 is pure dog shit. So um I'm not saying I want every horror game to just give the player big badass guns and just let them shoot everything in the face. No, because if you done that, that would basically turn it into an action game with very minor horror elements. Now, that's not what I want. So I don't want anyone to think that that's what I do want, since I am criticizing the you can't fight back mechanic. The reason I'm criticizing this mechanic is because it's simply getting too boring. I mean, it feels like every horror game has this same trope where you're completely defenseless and all you can do is run, hide, or die. There's no fighting back. You're completely defenseless. Yada, yada, yada. It's just getting really boring now, because it feels like every horror game is doing it these days. Now, does this mechanic fit in some certain horror games? Well, definitely yes. I mean, let's look at a game like Layers of Fear or Observer. These are games where nothing really chases you throughout those games, because they are not survival horror games. These are psychological horror games, and these games, like, their scare factor relies more on scaring you psychologically, like, showing you like really disturbing imagery, or like, putting you in like some really disturbing segments. These games are more about mind horror. So that's why the whole you can't fight back thing actually fits in with those types of games, because it wouldn't make sense. But in a survival horror game, I feel like this mechanic really doesn't fit in. You know, because like part of survival horror is actually defending yourself. Like that's part of the survival horror aspect. So I don't understand how these developers think it's cool to just like take away your defenses completely. And I'm not saying we should actually be able to like kill everything with our defenses, no. But we should at least be able to defend ourselves in these games and have more ways to fight back, and because that would add more variety. Because like, you know, Outlast is a game that is very beloved. You know, it's a horror classic. I do like the game, and I have reviewed it, and I've talked about it many times on my channel. I actually started this whole discussion with the whole Outlast is overrated video, which is currently sitting at around 70 views, by the way. Hope you guys like that little vid. But Outlast is actually one of the worst horror games you could ever play because it's so boring. Like the running and hiding feels fun and it's intense, but after a while, it just gets really boring. You know, I mean, I'm someone who does like the exploration at least. I mean, I like exploring because I feel like that's the best way to immerse yourself by actually exploring the area and exploring the environments that these games put you in. So it's not the environment that's the problem, it's the variety. Because even though I love exploring in these horror games and I like walking simulators, even I'm gonna get bored of that eventually. And you know that's why games like Outlast and any other game that has this whole you can't fight back thing, it just gets so boring and the variety is just tossed out the window because there simply is none. I mean, all you're doing in these games is just walking around solving puzzles and running and hiding. I mean, how is that fun? I mean, you could say that maybe I'm someone who's more like into Resident Evil or games like that. I mean, I did really enjoy Resident Evil 7 and 8 along with Resident Evil 2 and 3. I used to hate those games, but since I'm getting so bored of this whole you can't fight back trend, with these horror games nowadays, I'm actually someone who's really starting to enjoy games like Resident Evil and Dead Space. And Resident Evil 4, man, that was the worst Resident Evil of all time. So was 5 and 6. Like that whole trilogy of Resident Evil 4, 5 and 6, all three of those games were the actual downfall of Resident Evil. Those were the games that turned Resident Evil into a fucking action game. So those games were garbage. Now back to this whole trend here. It's just extremely lazy nowadays because there are so many developers, like mostly indie developers, who they're just trying to get on the cash cow, make a horror game, like what's the same thing over and over again. When they make these horror games, they are literally doing it just to print money. Yeah, they put a little bit of time into it, but like they don't put enough time into it to actually make it unique from the other horror games in this whole genre. And that's why it's so annoying and so bad. Now, what would be the alternative to this whole you can't fight back thing? Well, I'm glad that's what you're thinking, and I'm glad that's what you ask. Let's look at a game like Resident Evil 7. Now, in that game, this is the game that saved Resident Evil, by the way. In this game, this is a survival horror game at its finest, by the way. Just like the first Resident Evil, which is a masterpiece, by the way. In this game does survival horror absolutely perfectly. Because basically what they do is they balance the mechanic of not being able to fight back. Because this is a game that doesn't give you big badass guns and lets you shoot everything in the face. No, this is a game that has resource management, limited ammunition, and literally everything in between. And not only that, but even when you are fighting back against like the molded people, the molded monsters in Resident Evil 7, or Jack Baker or Marguerite Baker, like when you fight back against these foes, they still make it scary. Like you don't feel like a badass like you do in in Resident Evil 5 or The Evil Within, which is another bad game, by the way. No, you don't feel like a badass in this game because you're actually, using your weapons to actually defend yourself. They managed to still make fighting back still scary. And not only that, but I think it would actually be better if these games actually did have the player fighting back, because I think that would be a lot more intense, making the player face their fears and face whatever's chasing them and do their absolute best to defend themselves and, defend their lives. So I feel like that's actually an even better way to scare the player instead of just stripping them away from all their defense mechanisms whatsoever. But, in Resident Evil 7, like, even when you do face, like, either the molded or, like, one of the bosses, they still make it absolutely terrifying. Like, fighting back against the foes in Resident Evil 7 is still absolutely terrifying. The player is still scared out of their mind, and it's also a lot more intense, and most of all, it's fun. Because, why else would you play a horror game if you don't want to be both scared and having fun? Because being scared is having fun, and these games do it absolutely perfectly. We're going to talk about another horror game that also does this really good. But you know, in Resident Evil 7, another thing I really like is like there are moments in Resident Evil 7 where Jack Baker will be pursuing you around the house. He'll be like just walking around. You could be exploring the house, like you know, either solving a puzzle or just doing anything else. You're just messing around, and Jack Baker will just start chasing you. Now, what you could do is you could either run and hide, because you can do that, or you can choose to fight him with whatever guns or you know weapons that you have. And what I like is you cannot kill Jack Baker in the game. Not at least not in those moments. No. But what you could do is if you shoot him enough times, you could basically incapacitate him and he'll be on the floor for a little while, just you know, kind of knocked out. You know, just taking a nap because you put like 3 bullets in his fucking forehead. So, but what I like here is he's not dead. He's just incapacitated. This is actually another way to make this whole mechanic more intense, because basically what this does is the player has successfully defended themselves and they now have a little bit of time to finish what they have to do in order to reach a checkpoint. This makes the game much more intense because now the player has to quickly figure out what they got to do so that way they could actually reach a checkpoint before the enemy wakes back up, and that enemy being Jack Baker. So this is why Resident Evil 7 specifically is such a great game that balances the whole you can't fight back thing, because while you could defend yourself, it's still absolutely terrifying. Now, like I was saying, this makes the whole thing a lot more intense, because even though the player has successfully defended himself against Jack Baker, the player now must quickly figure out what they're going to do next before Jack wakes back up. So this makes it a lot more intense as well. And not only that, but like facing like one of the molded in this game, especially if you are playing on Madhouse difficulty, facing the molded in Resident Evil 7 is absolutely terrifying. Especially if, like, you know, with the whole resource management, because you really gotta save your bullets in this game, because if you run out of ammo in the middle of a fight, you are absolutely fucked. And then you'll be forced to run high. See, this is what I like about this whole thing, because the game is giving you an opportunity to defend yourself, and you could either fail to defend yourself, or you could defend yourself, but even if you do defend yourself, the player is still in a lot of danger, and that still makes it extremely terrifying, and that's what makes it still a good horror game. Now, another great game that done this absolutely great is actually a smaller game called Infliction. This is a game that I have reviewed on my channel, which is another, like, this is a great indie game, by the way, and Infliction, there is a spirit that is chasing you, like, throughout the house that you explore, and what you could do is you can either hide from her, but what you could do also is you have a small little camera with you, and what you could do is if you could actually, like, flash the ghost with your camera's light, that will basically cause the ghost to kind of, like, disappear for a little while. But the player is still in a lot of danger, because even though the player has successfully defended themselves from the spirit, it's still going to be chasing them. And Infliction is also a puzzle game, so you are going to be solving puzzles throughout this game. And like, Infliction is a game that always has the player doing something, so this also makes it a lot better, because like, let's say you're playing Infliction, like if you like, even if you actually do manage to face the ghost and like you successfully, like, you know, make her go away with your camera, now it's a lot more intense, because now you quickly, and I mean you seriously, got to figure out what you got to do next. You either got to find out what you're going to do, you got to make a plan, you got to figure out where you got to go before the spirit actually comes back. And not only that, but you could only use your camera one time, because it has to have like a little cooldown moment. It takes a little time for you to actually use your camera again. So it's not like you could just, like, you know, constantly like use your camera against the ghost, because if you use your camera against her one time, your camera is not going to work for a little while. So again, this makes it a lot more intense, because while the player has successfully defended themselves, they now have to quickly figure out what they got to do, or else the ghost or the enemy or whatever is just going to come back and kill them. So this makes it a lot more intense. It makes the player's heartbeat a lot more, and it makes it a whole lot more intense, because now they're on a time limit to quickly figure out what they got to do before the enemy comes back. And this is what makes this whole thing so good. This is how they balance it out, because instead of being like Outlast or any other horror game that, you know, copies this whole thing where you can't fight back, it just gets boring just running and hiding. It's fun for a while, but after a little time, it's just gonna get so boring. And if a game doesn't have enough variety, then it's not going to have enough to keep the player interested. So this is why this whole you can't fight back thing, this is why this whole mechanic needs to get away from survival horror games. Games like Layers of Fear or like psychological games, it's okay for this mechanic to be in those games, because these are not games that rely on chase scenes or fighting back against, you know, monsters or ghosts or anything. These are games that try and scare you in a different way, like, you know, with psychological horror. But, you know, survival horror games really shouldn't have this. And as I was just saying, you know, Resident Evil 7 and Infliction. And I also like the idea of the player being on a time limit. I like how the player has to quickly figure out what they gotta do now that they have successfully fought back. Because even though they have successfully defended themselves, now they're on a strict time limit to quickly figure out what they gotta do. And that makes it so much more intense because it can even cause the player to panic because now they have to hurry up, they gotta figure out what they gotta do exactly next, or they gotta have a really good plan so that way when, you know, the ghost or whatever, like, you know, whatever enemy comes back. I wish more developers would use this thing. I mean, I wish they would look more at games, I wish they would look more at games like Resident Evil and Infliction for guidance, you know, instead of looking at a game like Outlast, because Outlast is just so boring. It's one of the most boring horror games ever made. I mean, I don't hate Outlast, but I just hate that it started this trend, both Outlast and Amnesia. And does this mechanic work in Outlast? I mean, sort of. I mean, I just don't like this idea in an actual survival horror because I don't think the idea of survival horror should be just running and hiding. Part of survival horror should be actually defending yourself. Not killing, but defending yourself. And talking again about Resident Evil 7's Molded, there's so many things that could actually happen to the player as they're fighting back. And this is what I mean with, you know, like, you know, making it still terrifying even though the player can fight back, because even though these games are allowing the player to fight back, it's still so terrifying because the player has some pretty menacing odds against them. And specifically in Resident Evil 7, like, you know, if the molded like start ganging up on you and like if you miss your shots, this makes it so much more intense and it puts a lot more fear in the player when the game is actually encouraging them to fight back using the little resources that they have. And another game that done this well is Visage. Visage is a lot like more like Fatal Frame because you're literally fighting demons in that game with a camera. Visage has the same thing with Infliction. Basically, like there's a scene in Visage, like Lucy's chapter specifically, where like this fucking weird ass demon or whatever, like with claws, like Freddy Krueger claws, he'll be chasing you throughout the house, right? Now, you could actually miss your camera flash on this thing. Like, you could actually miss the shot and you could just get killed. So, this again makes it makes fighting back a lot more scarier because like the player could like, you know, miss their shot in Visage, you know, with the camera. And again, it just makes it a lot more scarier to actually be able to defend yourself against these things because the player could either fail or it just may not go as planned. So, you know, just it makes it a lot more intense, a lot more fun and intense. And, you know, yeah, so now that you guys get what I'm talking about, this is why this whole mechanic where you can't fight, that's why this mechanic is just getting so old and just so tiresome. And there's a new horror game coming out right now. I believe it's called Madison. I'm really hoping they, you know, put some more variety because like I said, if a game, especially a horror game, does not have enough variety, it's just going to get old and boring and it's just going to lose everything really, really quickly. And you may be thinking, well, how does this actually add more variety while, you know, making the player like, you know, or giving the player a chance to actually defend themselves? Well, obviously more variety because the player has so many choices. They could either choose not to defend themselves and try and save their ammo for or whatever it is for something else, or they could try and defend themselves so that way they can have more time. But that's what also makes it scary because even though they've defended themselves, they're still in a lot of danger and now they have to quickly find out what they gotta do before more enemies or foes or whatever starts, you know, chasing them or whatever. So yeah, that's why this mechanic sucks, and that's why games like Outlast and any other game that, you know, where you can't fight back, this is why this is just a really bad concept. And another thing I quickly want to talk about is jump scares. I cannot stand jump scares. The lack of variety, the lack of any creativity in a jump scare is just so painful. It's also the fact that anything could jump scare you. A fucking cat could jump scare you. You know, it's not the actual scare that matters. It's the sound. If something jumped out at you with a really like loud noise, obviously that will frighten you, but it's not the actual image that would jump scare you. Okay, that actually is a pretty scary image, but anyways, it's not the actual image that jump scares you, it's the sound. And so many horror games have that shit, where it's just a loud sound, you know, it jumps out at you. It's a cheap scare. It's a cheap and ineffective way to scare the player. Sure, it will make you jump, but I found myself being more frustrated after getting jump scared than, you know, actually being shaken up. Visual horror is a lot more better. If you show the player, or if you show someone who's watching a horror, even a horror movie, visual horror and imagery horror is the best way to go, because if you show someone something extremely terrifying, like this for example, that's gonna stick inside their mind. If you show someone something extremely terrifying, that's gonna be trapped inside their mind and they're gonna keep thinking about it. So that's why visual horror is a lot better than just jump scares. But yeah, guys, that is the end of this discussion. That was my I personally I think this is one of the biggest problems with modern horror games because so many developers have this same concept where you can't fight back and all you can do is just run, hide, and solve puzzles and yada yada yada. And I'm thankful for games like Resident Evil because Resident Evil basically balances this out. And that's what I'm gonna call this: balancing out you can't the whole you can't fight back thing. Because although you can fight back, they still make it absolutely terrifying. Instead of just absolutely taking away all of your defense mechanisms, literally. And again, I'm trying not to jump on the whole hate train for Outlast, but Outlast is a bad game. I'm sorry, but it is. The only good thing about Outlast is the story and the characters, but the gameplay for Outlast is absolutely atrocious. At least Amnesia was more scarier, because I cannot tell you how many times in Outlast I was literally just trolling the enemies because the enemies were just so unscary and ineffective. I think the only enemy in Outlast that was actually kind of creepy was Eddie Gluskin, and I think anyone could agree with that. But Chris Walker and the cannibal Frank Manera, they're just not really scary. But yeah, I do not hate Outlast. I just don't think it's a very effective horror game. That's just my opinion. I think games like Resident Evil are a lot better. Another problem with modern horror games is they somehow make it not scary anymore by adding too much action. Horror games should not have over the top action like The Evil Within, because The Evil Within is another really shitty game. Probably one of the worst survival horror games of all time. The Evil Within is I'm gonna save that for another video, but yeah, for now on, guys, that was my discussion. This is what I think is the problem with modern horror games. Let me know, what do you think is wrong with modern horror games? Yes, they have a lot of problems, but I just really hope more developers start putting more variety, because horror games these days are really really lacking in actual variety and adding new and improved things to the genre, because I'm just getting so bored. I mean, I could pay $50 for a horror game right now and I could expect it to be the exact same as the one I bought for 30 yesterday. And as a huge horror fan, this honestly really hurts my soul. It damages my soul. It hurts me. I'm desperately hurt. I'm crying right now. Well, I wouldn't say crying, but I'm crying on the inside because I do not want to see the horror genre fail. I do not want this genre to be milked. I want this genre to be as creative and have as much variety as any other genre, because I am one of the biggest horror fans in the world. So yeah, guys, let me know what you think about this whole topic and discussion. Let me know, what do you think of modern horror games? Do you think they're going in the right direction with the whole you can't fight back thing? And do you think they have enough variety? Let me know, ladies and gentlemen. But yeah, I got plenty of other videos coming soon, including a crossover with M64 Bros. So yeah, I got a lot of videos coming today, so stay tuned, guys. And for all of you who have subscribed, thank you so much for subscribing to my channel and actually watching my video. And if you actually made it through to this point of the video, I have nothing but gratitude for you. Thank you so much for hearing me ramble on about this. Even if you're not into the horror genre, just thank you for watching my video, anyone who does. But anyways, guys, this was Mr. Rage 22, aka the world's most precious little Christian boy. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. And yeah, take care, guys. I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.